On a dry morning in May of 1974, in Yakima County, Washington, the Orchard Board voted to terminate the only county beekeeper they had ever employed, a 71-year-old man named Harold Bennett, who had spent 46 seasons tending bees across nearly 12,000 acres of apple and cherry orchards. The vote took less than 10 minutes. The laughter lasted longer. It started low, just a few chuckles from the younger growers seated near the back of the Grange Hall. Men in pressed denim and polished boots who had begun replacing hand labor with new spray rigs and chemical pollination boosters shipped in from California. "Bees are outdated," one of them said, loud enough for the room to hear. Another added, "We've got better ways now." And then someone laughed outright. Harold didn't. He stood there in the same brown canvas coat he'd worn every spring since 1938, his hand still carrying the faint, permanent scent of smoke and honey, and he nodded once, like a man being told something he had already accepted long before anyone else had said it out loud. But he wasn't alone. Standing near the back wall, half in shadow, was his daughter, Margaret Bennett, 32 years old, quiet, watching. Let me tell you about Harold Bennett. He started keeping bees in April of 1928 in Franklin County, Idaho, with a single Langstroth hive his father built from scrap pine boards. By 1942, he was running 240 hives, each one carefully tracked in a handwritten ledger, each queen marked and replaced on a strict 2-year cycle. By 1955, Yakima County had hired him officially, $3, $200 a year, to oversee pollination across multiple orchards that, at the time, produced nearly 18% of Washington state's apples. He didn't just keep bees. He knew them. He could tell when a colony was failing just by the sound it made when you lifted the lid. He could smell disease before it spread. He rotated hives with the kind of precision most men reserve for machinery. And for nearly 2 decades, he made the county's orchards bloom like clockwork, until they decided he was no longer necessary. "Chemicals are cheaper," the board chairman said, adjusting his glasses. "And faster." Harold nodded again. Then he turned and walked out. Margaret followed. They didn't speak until they reached the truck, a 1966 Ford F-250 faded red, with a flatbed that still carried 6 empty hive boxes from the last delivery Harold had made just 3 days earlier. "You heard them," Margaret said finally. "I did. They don't understand." Harold placed one hand on the edge of the flatbed, fingers tracing the worn wood. "They don't have to," he said. "That was all. Let me tell you about Margaret Bennett. She wasn't what the county expected. No husband, no children, a degree in agricultural biology from Washington State University in 1964, back when fewer than 5% of women in the program graduated. She came back to Yakima not because she had to, but because she chose to, and she chose bees, not just the way her father knew them, but deeper. She studied colony collapse patterns before the term existed. She tracked nectar flows by elevation and temperature. She understood that pollination wasn't just a seasonal task. It was a system, but none of that mattered in that room. To them, she was just Harold's daughter, and Harold was just a man they had just replaced. The new system they brought in was called the Polymax 300, a chemical pollination stimulant sprayed directly onto blossoms, designed to mimic the natural fertilization process without relying on insects. It cost $18 per acre. Bees cost $25. That was enough. By June of 1974, every major orchard in Yakima County had switched. The bees were moved off. The hives were stacked behind barns. And Harold Bennett went home. For the first time in 46 years, he did not prepare for the next bloom. But Margaret did. She started small, 20 hives, then 40, then 72, all placed on a piece of land no one wanted anymore, a 14-acre patch of uneven ground just outside Wapato, Washington, where the soil had been overworked and abandoned by a grower who couldn't keep yields up. "You're wasting your time," one of the younger orchard managers told her in August of 1974, leaning against his brand-new John Deere 4020 95 horsepower diesel, purchased that spring for $9,800. "No one's using bees anymore." Margaret didn't argue. She just kept working. Have you ever known something was right, even when everyone around you had already decided it wasn't. Have you ever kept going anyway? By the spring of 1975, the Polymax 300 had been used across nearly 9,000 acres. The first bloom looked promising. Uniform, fast, controlled, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like the board had been right, until the fruit started setting. Smaller, irregular, some trees heavy, others nearly bare. By harvest, yields were down 12%, not catastrophic, but enough to raise questions. The board blamed weather, then labor, then timing. Anything but the bees. Harold didn't say a word. Margaret said even less, but she kept adding hives. 112 by 1976, 160 by 1977, all on that same forgotten piece of land. And then, in April of 1977, something happened that no one in Yakima County was prepared for, because while the orchard struggled to bloom evenly for the third year in a row, Margaret Bennett's land, 14 acres no one had wanted, flowered in a way no one could explain. And that was the moment the laughter started to fade. But not fast enough. Not yet, because what one of those orchard managers said next, standing right there at the edge of her field, would change everything. And he said it loud enough for everyone to hear. He didn't just question her. He laughed. Out loud. April 19th, 1977. Yakima County. Late morning. The air still cold enough to see your breath if you stood still long enough. The orchard manager's name was Daniel Reeves, 38 years old, educated, efficient, the kind of man who wore a wristwatch even in the field and checked it often. He had taken over 1,200 acres of apple orchards from his father in 1971 and modernized everything. Sprayers, irrigation lines, chemical inputs. His numbers were clean, his books cleaner, and standing at the edge of Margaret Bennett's land, looking out over 14 acres of dense, uneven bloom, he couldn't hide it anymore. This, he said, gesturing toward the hives, this is your solution? The men behind him shifted. Some smirked. One chuckled. Then Daniel laughed. Not cruel, not loud enough to echo, but sharp, dismissive, final. Bees, he said again. You're 3 years behind the rest of us. Margaret didn't move. She stood with her hands tucked into the pockets of her canvas jacket, boots planted in soil that still held moisture from the previous night's frost. You're looking at it wrong, she said quietly. That only made it worse. Daniel shook his head, smiling now, turning slightly so the others could see his reaction. No, he said, I'm looking at it exactly right. Let me tell you about that moment, because it wasn't just a laugh. It was a decision. A line drawn between what people thought they knew and what they were about to learn the hard way. Margaret didn't raise her voice, didn't defend herself. She simply walked past him, straight into the field. And if you followed her, which only one man did, a quiet older grower named Frank Donnelly, you would have seen something Daniel Reeves missed entirely. The sound, not loud, not dramatic, but constant. Thousands of bees moving between blossoms, each one doing a job no machine had ever been able to replicate with that level of precision. Frank listened. Daniel didn't. By harvest of 1977, the county numbers came in, down again, another 9%. That made 3 years in a row. The board called an emergency meeting in September. The explanations were running out. Weather patterns didn't align. Chemical application rates were consistent. Labor shortages had stabilized. And yet the fruit wasn't. It didn't set evenly. It didn't size evenly. And most importantly, it didn't sell evenly. Buyers noticed. They always do. Let me tell you something about pollination. Not in theory. In practice. Because this is where most people get it wrong. They think pollination is just about transferring pollen from one flower to another. And technically that's true. But what matters is how it's done. Bees don't just move randomly. They follow patterns, specific rows, specific trees, even specific sides of a tree based on sunlight and temperature. That consistency ensures even fertilization. Even fertilization leads to uniform fruit. Uniform fruit is what buyers pay premium prices for. Chemical stimulants, they can trigger growth. but they can't replicate behavior. And in agriculture, behavior matters more than reaction. By October of 1977, whispers started. Quiet ones at first. Maybe we pulled the bees too fast. Maybe there's a balance. Maybe... Daniel didn't agree. Not yet. He doubled down. In January of 1978, he ordered an upgraded system. The Polymax 500, newly released, $22 per acre, marketed as next-generation synthetic pollination enhancement. It'll fix it, he told the board. They believed him, because they needed to. Margaret didn't say anything, but she expanded again. 210 hives by spring, all still on that same 14 acres. Frank Donnelly visited her twice that winter, didn't ask questions, just watched, listened, then left. Have you ever stood in a room where everyone agreed on something and still felt like they were all wrong? Have you ever watched someone else hold their ground without saying a word? Spring of 1978 came early, warmer than usual. Bloom hit fast. Daniel's orchards looked perfect, clean, uniform, controlled. The Polymax 500 was applied on schedule. Every acre, every row, no delays, no mistakes. For 2 weeks, everything held. Then something shifted, not visibly at first, but in the numbers. Blossom drop rates increased. Fruit set became erratic again, worse than before. By mid-May, entire sections of Daniel's orchard showed uneven development, clusters of undersized fruit next to branches with nothing at all. He didn't understand it. Neither did the board. But Frank Donnelly did, because he had been somewhere else that morning, standing on the edge of Margaret Bennett's land, watching, listening, and what he saw there, what he heard, was not just different. It was undeniable. Because while 9,000 acres struggled to hold their yield, 14 acres were about to do something that would force every man in that county to reconsider everything they thought they knew. And when Frank walked into that board meeting in June of 1978, he didn't sit down. He didn't wait his turn. He just said one sentence. And Daniel Reeves heard every word of it. I've seen something you need to look at. Frank Donnelly didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't have to. The room went quiet anyway. June 3rd, 1978. Yakima County Grange Hall. Same building. Same long wooden table. Same men sitting in the same chairs where they had laughed 4 years earlier. Daniel Reeves looked up first. What are you talking about? He asked. Frank didn't answer immediately. He took off his hat, held it in both hands. Turned it once, slow. Then he said it again. I've seen something you need to look at. Let me tell you about Frank Donnelly. He was 74 years old in 1978. Farm pears before apples. Started in 1931 with 2 mules and a borrowed plow in Benton County. He had seen droughts, freezes, price collapses, and more than one new system that promised to replace the old ways. He didn't speak often in meetings, but when he did, people listened because he had nothing to sell, nothing to prove, and nothing left to lose. Where? Daniel asked. Frank looked at him. Out by Wapato. That was all it took, because everyone in that room knew what was out by Wapato. 14 acres. Bees. Margaret Bennett. The same place Daniel had laughed. They drove out that afternoon. 3 trucks. 8 men. Dust rising behind them as they left the paved road and moved onto the uneven dirt track that led to Margaret's land. She was already there, standing near the hives. Same posture. Same quiet presence. She didn't wave, didn't approach. She just waited. Daniel stepped out first. He looked around, and for the first time in 4 years, he didn't smile, because it didn't look like it had in 1977. It looked stronger, denser bloom, healthier trees, branches heavy with early fruit set that already showed signs of uniform growth. Not perfect, but consistent. And consistency was what he had been losing. What did you do? He asked. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Nothing new, she said. That answer frustrated him. Then why does it look like this? She walked past him again, same as before. And this time he followed, right into the field. The sound hit him first. Low, steady, everywhere. Bees, thousands of them, moving with purpose, row to row, tree to tree. No gaps, no randomness, just work. Let me tell you about those hives. 210 Langstroth boxes, each one maintained by hand. Queens replaced every 24 months. Colonies split and rotated based on bloom timing and nectar flow. Each hive producing an average of 60,000 to 80,000 worker bees during peak season. That's over 12 million pollinators on 14 acres. Not forced, not sprayed. Working because that's what they were built to do. Daniel stood there longer than he meant to. Long enough for something to shift. Not in the field. In him. Walk with me. Margaret said. He did. They moved through 3 rows. Then 5. Then 10. Everywhere the same pattern. Even fruit set. Consistent spacing. No clusters of failure. No empty branches. Just balance. Have you ever watched something work so well that it made everything you believe feel incomplete? Have you ever realized in a single moment that you might have been wrong for years? Daniel stopped, looked out over the field, then back at the trucks where the others were still standing. Watching him now, waiting. What would it take? He asked quietly. Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked at the trees, then at the hives, then at him. Time, she said. That was the part he didn't want to hear, because time was the one thing he had been trying to eliminate from his system. Efficiency didn't wait, but nature did, and that was the difference. By harvest of 1978, the numbers came in again. Daniel's orchards, down 11%. Margaret's 14 acres, up 18%. Not just in yield, in quality, uniform fruit, higher grade, better prices. The board couldn't ignore it anymore. They called another meeting. Same room, same table. But this time, no one laughed. Daniel spoke first. We were wrong, he said. Simple, direct, honest. No excuses, no deflection, just truth. Then he turned to Margaret. Can you scale it? That question hung in the air, because everyone in that room knew what it meant. Not just for one farm, for the entire county. Margaret looked at him, then at the others, then down at her hands, still carrying that same faint scent her father had always had. Smoke, honey, work. Yes, she said. And that was the moment everything changed. But not in the way anyone expected, because scaling something like that doesn't happen overnight. And what happened the following spring, when bees returned to Yakima County at a scale no one had seen before, didn't just fix the orchards. It revealed something else, something deeper, something Harold Bennett had known all along, and something he had never said out loud, because by the time the county finally understood it, Harold wasn't there to see it happen. Harold Bennett passed away on February 11th, 1979, in a small farmhouse just outside Wapato, Washington, with Margaret sitting beside him and a ledger book resting on the table where he had tracked every hive he had ever owned. He was 76 years old. He didn't leave behind much in the way of money. No large estate, no modern equipment, just 312 active hives, a 1966 Ford F-250 that still ran on the first turn, and a lifetime of knowledge written in careful pencil across pages that smelled faintly of wax and smoke. But what he left behind didn't need to be written down, because by the spring of 1979, Yakima County had already begun to change. Let me tell you what that change looked like. It didn't come all at once. It came row by row, farm by farm. Daniel Reeves was the first to commit. Not halfway, not cautiously, fully. In March of 1979, he signed a contract with Margaret Bennett to place 480 hives across his 1,200 acres. One hive for every 2.5 acres, spaced deliberately to match bloom patterns and elevation shifts. It cost him more than chemicals ever had, $31 per acre. His accountant questioned it. His neighbors watched. But Daniel didn't hesitate, because he had seen something that couldn't be explained away anymore. Others followed. Frank Donnelly added 220 hives to his pear orchards. 3 more growers joined by April. By the time bloom hit in late spring of 1979, over 2,000 hives had returned to Yakima County, not as a replacement, as a return. Margaret didn't rush it. She expanded carefully. built new boxes through the winter, raised queens, trained 2 assistants, both young, both willing to learn something most people had already dismissed just 5 years earlier. By harvest, the numbers told a story no one could argue with anymore. Countywide yields up 14%, uniformity restored, buyer confidence back, prices higher, but numbers don't carry memory. People do. Daniel Reeves changed, not overnight, but steadily. He stopped rushing conversations, started listening more than he spoke. He still wore his watch, still ran a tight operation, but there was something different in the way he walked his fields. Slower, more observant, like he understood now that control wasn't the same as understanding. In October 1981, 3 years after that day in the field, he stood in front of the same board that had laughed in 1974. And this time, he didn't defend the system. He acknowledged a mistake. We didn't just remove bees, he said. We removed something we didn't understand. No one laughed. Margaret didn't speak at that meeting. She didn't need to, because the orchards were speaking for her. By 1985, she was managing over 1,800 hives across 4 counties. Her name wasn't on a sign. There was no company logo, just a quiet network of farms that relied on something older than any system they had tried to replace. Have you ever seen something come back, not because it was new, but because it was right all along? Have you ever realized that progress sometimes means remembering? The truck still ran. That same 1966 Ford F-250. Margaret kept it, used it every spring. The paint faded more each year, but the engine held steady, like it understood its job wasn't to impress, just to keep moving. And the hives? They never stopped, season after season, bloom after bloom, working the same way they always had. No upgrades, no replacements, just care, time, understanding. Margaret never married, never left the land. When she passed in August of 2008 at 76, the same age her father had been, the hives were still active, still placed, still doing the work. They passed to her niece, a quiet woman named Ellen who had spent her summers learning beside her. And today, decades later, bees still move through Yakima County every spring, not as a novelty, not as a backup, as a necessity. Daniel Reeves retired in 1992, but he didn't sell the farm. He passed it to his son with one condition. Keep the bees, he said. And he meant it, because he had learned something most people don't get the chance to learn before it's too late. That being wrong isn't failure. Staying wrong is. And sometimes the loudest lesson doesn't come from a man who speaks the most. It comes from the one who never needed to. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. If you've ever known someone who held on to something everyone else gave up on, someone who stayed quiet while others laughed, tell me their story in the comments. I read every one. And if you want to hear about the farmer in Greene County who ran a steam tractor buried for 11 years and brought it back to life in a single afternoon, there's a story there you won't want to miss.